Hello, everybody. My name is Tiffany Allen, and I want to thank you all for tuning in to the first episode of my podcast called Eco Justice. I created this podcast because I wanted to get environmental organizations' perspectives on climate justice and why we need to talk about climate justice, the issues it presents, and ways to tackle and mitigate the problem. As you know, climate justice negatively affects minorities, low-income and underserved communities, and immigrant communities, and that is why we need to talk about it. Who I have here today is Hannah Evans, and she is part of the organization called Population Connection. All right, Hannah, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Before we start, in case there's anyone who is new here, Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we are also very invested in education and outreach about the connections between global population growth, access to healthcare, and environmental sustainability. And I am the communications manager by Population Connection.
So, my first question to you is, what is climate justice, and why is climate justice considered a social justice issue?
Climate justice is a term that's used to describe climate change as a multifaceted issue with many different political, economic, and social relevancies. So the term actually conceptualizes climate change and climate impacts as an ethical and political issue, rather than one that's just purely environmental or physical in nature. So climate justice actually speaks to the fact that the effects of climate change disproportionately impact some of the most marginalized populations, and highlights the contradictions embedded in that fact, right? That populations that are the least culpable for the consumption of fossil fuels and the production of greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change, will nevertheless experience its most severe effects. And this is and should be understood as a massive humanitarian problem. This is a really large scale human rights injustice around the world that we're seeing. So in solving climate change, while it's obviously very complex and there are many different approaches to it, and what climate justice is asks us to look at climate change as in terms and solutions in terms of grassroots efforts, right? And the need for it to be inclusive, right? So it should identify and actually work to dismantle systems of oppression and structural inequalities that have not only put innocent people in really grave danger with regards to climate change, but that have in many ways caused large-scale ecological collapse, right? So this is a movement, again, that's calling on us to really re-envision the future of this planet in terms that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable, which of course would require some pretty substantial shifts in production practices and economic structures and the way that we trade and so on, but also within ourselves, right? So really looking deeper at our relationship with the natural environment, which surrounds us and sustains us, and working to construct new realities that work with rather than against natural systems, which are incredibly complex and from which we have a lot to learn. And so climate vulnerability in Uganda has a lot to do with present and future population growth. So for one, 40% of the country actually lives in extreme poverty, earning less than $1.90 per day. Also, over 75% of the country is under the age of 30, which means that future population growth is almost certain no matter what. This is because Uganda has maintained an annual growth rate of around 3% for the past few decades, indicating that the population will double every 23 years. So right now, Uganda is currently adding close to 1 million people per year. And also the vast majority of Ugandans, over 70%, are small scale or subsistence farmers who depend on rain-fed agriculture to survive. So global warming is going to make food production incredibly more difficult, if not impossible, for many different populations. And this warming that's projected to occur is going to intensify precipitation patterns and exacerbate droughts and flooding, all to the detriment of crop yields. So the country's meager contribution to global CO2 emissions is actually really disproportionate to the climate impacts it faces. Uganda, because of its low economic status and geographic location, ranks among the world's most vulnerable to climate change, but it also ranks amongst the least prepared countries with regards to addressing climate change. So together, things like large-scale deforestation, soil erosion, and climate impacts actually threaten to undermine the significant improvements that poverty eradication has seen throughout the past several decades. So again, while the country has worked very hard on developing and increasing its economic status and increasing access to resources and social services and things like that, climate change is now inhibiting that progress and further institutionalizing poverty. So this is a really big problem for a lot of different countries throughout the world that are in the process of developing, because they are facing, like, at once the very urgent need to develop economically speaking and to transform their economies to be more advantageous monetarily speaking, but they're unable to do so because of the climate restrictions that are prohibiting food production or agriculture exports or anything that would help them sort of transcend that socioeconomic state. And so in very many ways, population and environment issues have acute relevance to climate justice. And as we've been talking about, the effects of climate change will be the most severe for the least culpable, for those who are the least culpable for anthropogenic emissions which cause climate change. And so in recognizing the disproportionate impact that marginalized populations feel regarding climate change, one other key aspect of the concept of climate justice is that there are large and overarching systems of oppression and exclusion that have resulted from extensive histories of colonization and neocolonialism and social exclusion and marginalization that contribute to this increased vulnerability and to other environmental injustices. And this makes sense, like in a sort of baseline, straightforward way. The fact that low-income populations like in Bangladesh and Uganda are more vulnerable to climate change has in part to do with the fact that there are high poverty rates in the country. There's low economic status. There's a lack of available resources overall, because in a straightforward sense, the countries are less affluent than in comparison to other countries. But climate justice is asking us to take a step further and to look at not only the present day sort of economic status of a country, but also to recognize and sort of incorporate the very extensive and impactful histories of colonialism and exploitation that have contributed to this present status and worsened climate vulnerability. And of course, this is happening all over the world. And as the world continues to warm, more and more people are going to be exposed to climate impacts, and more places will become uninhabitable. And so on the front lines of these climatic shifts and these increases in global temperatures are some of the world's most marginalized populations. And the New York Times actually just published a piece looking at the disproportionate impact that is already having in various places throughout the world. And that article, and it's fantastic if you haven't read it, they go through and look at 4 or 5 different countries and states throughout the world, and they look at the impact that particular people and families are having with regards to excessive heat. But the New York Times article has put forth information saying that for the past 60 years, every 10 years has been hotter than the last, and 2020 is no different. So temperatures have actually reached 100 degrees in the Arctic Circle this June. And there's examples of like record-breaking temperatures all over the world. But in Baghdad this July, for example, temperatures actually reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit, which again broke a lot of records. Temperatures in the Sahel region are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. And future projections show an increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius above 2013 levels by 2050 alone. And further warming could reach 8 degrees Celsius above the same levels by 2100. And so these increases are not only life-threatening, but they will likely make this region just uninhabitable. And this is a region where the population is growing the fastest in the entire world. So again, presenting really major humanitarian issues. So the New York Times, as I was saying, they chose about 4 or 5 different locations to interview people who are already enduring the effects of climate-related heat waves. Some, like a man named Hasib Hotak, who's a homeless Afghan refugee living in Athens, Greece. He regularly sleeps on a rooftop because it's too hot to sleep inside. Another example is in Houston, which I just learned is one of the United States' fastest warming cities, excuse me. And low-income families who are often working in labor-intensive jobs such as construction or in some cases housekeeping struggle to survive in that heat. Average temperatures in Houston alone have risen more than 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. And in mid-July, the city's heat index peaked above 110 degrees. And it essentially offered a glimpse into the future, right? If emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise at their current pace, Houston could see 109 days each year on average where the heat index tops 100 degrees. And this presents real problems in terms of environmental health and for people who are working labor-intensive jobs outside.
So based off the answer from the last question I asked, my next question to you would be, so the Bali Principles mean the discursive framework of climate change from a scientific technical debate to one about ethics focused on human rights and justice. So how would you say that climate justice is a social justice issue based on the Bali Principles?
Hopefully not. We're not immune to the sort of structural inequities that are increasing climate vulnerability. In fact, in some of the more localized contexts, the environmental justice movement has shed light on some of the most profound and often hidden inequalities of our time. So the environmental justice movement actually started around 1978 in the United States, when the governor of Warren County, North Carolina, okayed the dumping of over 30,000 gallons of PCB, which is a toxic chemical, in a community that was 75% minority and one of the state's poorest. So the movement gained political clout in the 1980s and has continued into the present with the intent of focusing again on the structural inequities that contribute to things like one's propensity to experience an increased risk of exposure to toxic chemicals, to pollution, and to other environmental toxins, or to the likelihood that your community will be located next to an extractive or highly polluting facility. We're not all, breathing the same air. And this is a major principle of environmental justice and climate justice as well, essentially. So both of them seek to understand the intersections between environmental inequities and social injustices. And so in this work, it's really important to understand the differences in experience between individuals, groups, states, and countries as they relate to socio-political histories and systems of oppression, which are all interconnected. So for example, if we want to learn about poverty from an environmental justice perspective, we shouldn't just research where incomes are lowest, right? Rather, we should seek to understand the root of economic inequality, which are certainly delineated according to race and histories of structural oppression and exclusion and so forth. And further, it's not accurate only to look at environmental issues and environmental damage or climate change. We must also look at where it's happening, who will be most affected, and why. We need to look at how histories of imperialism and hegemonic rule have influenced a country's ability to develop and adapt to environmental change. And And in the US especially, understanding environmental justice means making the very clear connections between class, race, and gender inequities that have exacerbated environmental impacts and caused large-scale ecological decline. So in other words, environmental justice is not just a singular issue, but it's in fact rather a complex and interconnected web, so to speak, of social, political, and economic structures that influence climate change and ultimately the way that people interact with the environment. And so in creating solutions to things like climate change and to environmental conservation, the voices of those who are most affected by environmental damage must be included. So environmental justice has basic principles, and essentially it's arguing that there are, particular communities as delineated by things like race and socioeconomic status are more at risk for environmental harms that create health disparities. And so it looks at the sort of social constructs of race and class that can amplify the effects of exposures and health outcomes for populations in the United States. And so it recognizes that health disparities by race exist in part because of the well-documented tendency to build extractive and polluting facilities in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities.
Okay, I guess for my next and last question, I just want to ask, so central argument of climate justice means a reshaping of climate action from a technical effort to cut emissions into an approach that also addresses human rights and social inequality. So I wanted to know if you had any examples of climate justice that exemplified what central argument of climate justice means.
For example, in the US, the term is contentious in some ways and has been entangled in cultural identities that have been deliberately exclusive to marginalized and historically oppressed populations. So the Native American populations in the United States are well aware of this contradiction and have a long history of fighting for environmental justice and to protect their lands from corporate invasion, extraction, and so forth. And so, for example, in fighting against the construction or continued use of large oil pipelines like the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline, Native American groups have stood up against powerful corporate interests and highlighted the futility, ultimately, of fueling dependence on fossil fuels while potentially poisoning vital water systems. And they've called for a better, more inclusive and holistic approach to human-environment interactions, speaking to the very real importance of protecting nature as a way of protecting ourselves. And so the environmental and climate justice movements very necessarily are about bringing power back to the people and back to the most marginalized populations. Historically led by populations most affected by corporate-led environmental devastation and extractive facilities and so forth, the environmental justice movement seeks actually to dismantle the structural inequities that have pervaded social, political, and economic systems in the United States and ultimately around the world.
So I just wanted to ask if there's any last minute things that you want to add to the subject that we are talking about today.
The kind of ways that we realize climate justice and social justice more broadly. But the basic principles in creating these solutions are that they must be rooted in principles of human rights and social justice. Addressing climate solutions without addressing inequity is futile, and it's also going to be ineffective. Also, addressing climate change necessarily means addressing systemic inequalities that contribute to marginalization and worsen impacts. So recognizing that the very same processes that contribute to marginalization and social inequities are also the ones that are driving these extractive forces and this dependence on fossil fuels that is ultimately contributing to climate change. And finally, climate justice means changing our relationship with other humans, animals, and the planet to facilitate a better, more equitable future. And of course, achieving this is a pretty hefty feat. And I think that it should be really looked at as a long-term process and something that we're ready to be in for the long haul. And these types of realizations sort of challenge the very foundation of our society and our world economy as we've known them. And as hard as it is to talk about these issues, it's even more difficult to put it into practice. And in the United States, I think we've seen some examples of policy initiatives that have aimed at sort of addressing these inequities, things like the Green New Deal and the new Climate Action Plan that was just recently unveiled. And that works specifically to benefit low-income communities, which means looking at things like disparities in education, housing, access to resources, and so on, and working to protect communities already at risk for environmental injustices. And globally, we could go into more detail on this, but the Sustainable Development Goals that have been set forth by the United Nations and aim to facilitate sustainable development throughout the world have also been used as a benchmark for countries to realize both environmental and social goals towards a more equitable future. So with that, I'm going to end it.
Well, that wraps up all the questions that I have. I just want to thank you, Hannah, for joining me and hope this was very informative.
Thank you.